the Alani, an ancient and medieval Iranian nomadic pastoral people of the North Caucasus that we mentioned often in our videos about the migration era, that I intentioned this video to be part of the series of made of all the various peoples, this being actually the first Iranic one, right? And we mentioned them often, in fact, as part of these broader, in fact, Iranic populations of the steppes that were overwhelmed at some point by the Germanic and the Hunnic migration, and that fundamentally poured mostly westwards into Europe, reviving also that military equestrian culture of the steppes that the same Europeans essentially has stemmed from, and that we're still reminiscent of, and that is also at the base of the of our knighthood, right? Of chivalry, of all a set of values and training techniques and codes, etc., that were to revive on this essentially aristocratic base, right? The elites that ruled this populations on the march, that, as you know, had a greater unity of command than the sedentary tribes for different reasons that we explained elsewhere. So they really deserve attention, as in particular the Alans had this post, let's say, from a Western perspective, migration era, but from their own perspective, like a permanent migration era, considering more or less their movements in the steppes. Yes, they sedentarized, as we'll see in the kingdom of Alania, in the Caucasian foothills, and having during the High Middle Ages this important dominion that also had an important role in the relations in the Byzantine Arab wars with the Khazars, even with the Rus, and that perhaps we'll speak better about another time on, because it's we don't know excessively much about that, but still it's one of those areas that you really want to look at in detail, their military organization, influences, etc. And the Alans are generally regarded as part of the Sarmatians, but let's say that these ethnic subdivisions are a bit classicistic. I mean, they were, like many others, fundamentally formulated by the great Mediterranean civilizations, and they do not reflect the fluidity of this world at many levels. In the steppes, it's kind of the most obvious reality, as we will see. They emerged essentially from the easternmost branch of the Indo-European peoples, thus from Central Asia. So much that were documented not just by the Greeks, the Romans, but also by the Chinese and many other peoples later on. And so they, as we'll see, they migrated largely, not entirely. Right? This is typical of migration era peoples, that somebody remains always back and also moves, as we will see, in different areas around, aside from the longer migrations. And they migrated westwards, becoming dominant among the Sarmatians on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, right? And they are mentioned by Roman sources since the 1st century AD. At that time, the region north of the Black Sea was frequently, it was quite active, right? It saw the launching of many raids deep into other territories. Had been actually since millennia, right? The Scythians, the populations, and were always poured into Mesopotamia at some point. The same Achaemenids, the same Parthians were fundamentally Scythian peoples, and even if the definitions can vary, but that's always the same old story of this nomadic populations pouring at different waves continuously into the surrounding continents. And in the West, we have to recover this idea, because not just as Europeans we properly stem in great part from those movements, but properly these things never quite ended. Like from a narrower Western European perspective, we say, okay, now that's the sedentary era, more or less like that, but move a few hundred kilometers east, you see that was the norm, right? Also for lots of peoples that were sedentary but had to suffer the waves of all these populations. And the story goes on. It's very complex, actually, as we will see. In Roman times, they in fact invested the Middle East. They actually harassed the Parthian Empire, the Caucasian provinces of Rome. And from the beginning of the first half of the 3rd century AD, the Goths, however, broke the Alan power on the Pontic steppe, right? And we don't know much about that, but as we will see, there was fundamentally a merging between the two cultures that also conferred, in fact, to the Goths the most advanced equestrian culture among the Germanic peoples, probably not changing them radically, as it's somewhat believed. We have to make videos about this at some point, but still meaningful enough to be regarded the best, the most, let's say, organized, the most, at least, military effective of the Germanic population, so much that the Huns also regarded them greatly, but also having subjugated them, together with the help, as we will see, of the same Alans that went a bit back and forth. And upon, in fact, the Hunnic defeat of the Goths in the Pontic steppe, and we are around 375 AD, many of the Alans migrated westwards, right, alongside with the Huns and these other Germanic tribes. They crossed the Rhine in famous the fatidic 406 AD, together with the Vandals and the Suebi, and they settled in Orléans, right, in Valence. And from this area, as we'll see, they controlled an important set, especially northern Gallic politics, checking also the Franks, etc. And around 409, they joined the Vandals and the Suebi, however, in crossing the Pyrenees into the rich Iberian Peninsula, right? And they settled in Lusitania and in the Hispania Cartaginensis. The region was, however, stable and crowded, so much that the Alans were defeated by the Visigoths in 418 AD, and they subsequently surrendered their authority to the Asdingi Vandals, and together with them in 428 they in fact would cross the Gibraltar Strait into North Africa, where they founded a powerful kingdom, the Vandalic one, which lasted until its conquest by the forces of the Roman Emperor Justinian I in 534 AD. We made a video about the Vandals as well, but we'll keep talking about them. We didn't do it very often, but that they're often overlooked as well. In all this, that there were other groups, as we've seen, of Alans that had remained behind, right, and that remained specifically under Hunnic rule, founding eventually the powerful kingdom of Alania in the north of Caucasus. Much later on, because of many movements that were happening in the area, this around the 9th century AD. And this entity, albeit contained geographically, but still, as we've seen, important for tipping the balance of the powers around, survived until the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. And there is a general perception that, supported by many Ossetian scholars, that the Alans would be essentially the ancestors of the modern Ossetians. As we will see, there is some base of truth to this, but always bear in mind that we better talk of essentially Alanized Caucasian peoples that were still pre-existing in the area, and still the Alans, as you understand, in their ethnogenesis, were probably also quite mixed on their own. The Alans, as we will see, also spoke an Eastern Iranian language that derived from the Scytho-Sarmatian branch, which in turn evolved into the modern Ossetian language. And the name of Alan represents the, let's say, an Iranian dialectal form of Aryan, so the noble, of the Arya people, etc., which the Alans represent a bit the top. If you look in continuity, I can't think of a single Aryan people that lasted that long properly as in continuity of its ethnic identity, right? And so much that they are very interesting to be studied, because they left a mark a bit in a very wide area of Eurasia. So today we will make essentially a short excursus on the main phases of Alan history. Eventually we will make more in-depth videos, but this is just to give an idea overall of what fundamentally they managed to achieve and how far and wide they affected Eurasian populations. Now, the Alans, as we were saying before, were documented by foreign observers from the 1st century AD under similar names. So Latin Alani, Greek Alanoi, the Chinese Alandial, and in the 2nd century, Alan in the 3rd century again, and Alanguo, right? Then the Parthian and Middle Persian language, we call them Alanan, which is a plural. In Arab, it would be Alan, at singular. In Syriac, ALANIE. In classical Armenian, Alang. In Georgian, Alaneti. It stands for the country of the Alans. In Hebrew, Alan, plural Alanim. And there are other versions naturally in the sources. For example, you have Latin spellings including Alauni or Halani with the H before the A. And the name was also preserved in the modern Ossetian language as Alon. And there is more to that. Now, the ethnonym Alan is, as we were saying before, a dialectal variant of the Old Iranian Ariana, right? That derived from the root Arya, meaning Aryan. The common self-designation of the Indo-Iranian peoples, and this probably came in use in the early history of the Alans for the purpose of uniting an heterogeneous group of tribes through the invocation of a common ancestral, let's say, Aryan origin. Naturally, in the steppes, this is very, first of all, we can't track what happened concretely, but the same name Aryan by itself, meaning the noble ones, is a vague terminology, was naturally, it's typical of the steppe. I mean, it's the idea that the best, the elite, the aristoi, right, joined together into, and that the common characteristic is such nobility. And that's where also why we talk so much about these peoples also in the genesis of European chivalry, etc., because there is properly an elite, an aristocratic ethos to such code of values, etc., together with cavalry, with the idea properly of being so rich and powerful and wealthy to be a nobleman, right? And naturally, there were lots of other peoples after them that in the steppes they're mostly clients peoples, that is subjected people, and hence that ferocious say Aryan aspect that we see also, I don't know, in Vedic India, the idea of properly the rulers are a different caste, even racially, from the rest of the population, and much of such divides lived on, for example, in, I don't know, in the Roman, in the Germanic aristocracy, is properly the idea that the noble is something, the people is something else, right? And this goes along with other aspects of religion that we will look at some point. So, like the name of Iran, Arianam, the adjective Ariana appears to be related to Arianem Vayo, that is stretch of the Aryas, that is essentially this mythical homeland of the early Iranians mentioned in the Avesta that we don't quite understand where, I mean, it's highly debated where it could have been, but that gave the name to these people. There are some derivatives that brought to ethnonyms, such as the Roxolani, that means the bright Alans, right? And this was an offshoot of the same Alans, whose name may be linked to religious practices. Also, the Alanorsoi, the white Alans, that there was perhaps a conglomerate of Alans and the Aorsi that were an Akin people, as we'll see now. And the same personal name Alan or Alen stems, in European history from the Latin Alanus, which may have been properly introduced by Alan settlers in Western Europe during the first millennium AD, as we will see now, as the Romans fundamentally settled them as federati largely in the western provinces. The Alans were also known over the course of their history by another group of related names, including the variations Azi, As, and Os, so that there are many correspondences. For example, the Romanian Yazi, as we'll see also, the city might have been actually founded by the Alans themselves, or Orlani. Bulgarian Uzi, Hungarian Yash, Russian Yazi, and Georgian, and I can't read the Georgian alphabet, so sorry, but it's something very similar. And it is the name of the root of the modern Ossetian as well. So that's good, the connection. So there is all a timeline here to understand, which we'll try to look at more concretely. So speaking of the early Alans, right? So the first mentions of names that historians link with the Alani, which is different from the